I see. Merciful God, you have sent me an apostle.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Horror seems like a simple concept to execute, especially in games where the player has control of their actions, making it more immersive compared to media such as movies or books. But from so many pieces of media in general that attempt horror, they fall flat in some way. While there are a good amount of standout titles, there are even more that do not meet the expectations for most. Horror in games has always had a mixed reputation. While horror is more often spoken about in games compared to other topics surrounding it, the typical consensus is that either the horror was not effective for multiple reasons, such as jump scares or consistent scares, not giving the player a break and desensitizing them, but that is not always the case when it comes to horror affecting people differently because it's personal to each player and how effective the horror is in the game to begin with. The question is, why do people want horror in various forms of media? Horror is not something that gives people pleasant or happy emotions.
Or at least should not.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine.
It may possibly bring excitement because of the adrenaline that it gives, leading to some people going out of their way to seek it or create it. Horror entertainment is typically a novel experience, meaning that it does not happen in the real world, and is a safe-framed way to satisfy a curiosity about a dark and morbid situation or story. The safety frame is why people are okay with horror in entertainment, because no matter if it's a movie, game, or haunted house, you know whatever evil or monstrous things cannot hurt you physically. Mentally, on the other hand, if you are not prepared for it, may do some harm. Another piece to it is the protective frame of sorts, where you know it's not a real situation or story, but just well done enough where the effects immerse you in the experience. Along with that is the ability of control around that experience. If you do not have control of the experience anymore, then it's not an enjoyable time, such as being able to walk away from a horror experience if you are overwhelmed by it or dislike it. In turn, with the ability of control is having some level of confidence to manage and overcome the experience. Horror gives people a mix of good and negative emotions, which plays into why some will seek it out to get those feelings but yet stay safe. Typically, if someone is seeking horror, then they may want higher emotion sensations, while others who do not want those types of feelings for whatever reasons may avoid it instead. So how do these pieces play into people enjoying horror games in particular? These framings align with the game side of horror nearly the exact same as any other forms of horror media, but with the protection frame control part being much more impactful to no surprise. But what are the going to be spoiling parts of the following games, so either play or watch those games before continuing if you do not want to be spoiled. Pieces of the effective horror puzzle are deeply subjective to begin with because of the personal touch for everyone. But what are the general points in which horror is most often effective? The unknown, isolation, dread and tension, disempowerment, intrigue, unpredictability, narrative, atmosphere, and the logic of the situation. All of these pieces, if done right, form into what every game, let alone horror games, is wanting to do in effectively immersing the player. If one of these pieces to form the whole is not right, then that immersion will either fail to form or will eventually fall apart.
Piece number 2000. Took a long time, many hours, but thank you.
While researching for this video, I ran into a lot of authors writing articles and essays that do touch on a very wide overview of how effective horror can be achieved, but often do not go much in depth, such as this article from Screenrant where they have a decent quote for effective horror, but it's still very broad. Quote, "If a game is immersive and well realized, the player can completely lose themselves in play, allowing everything to feel more real. This sense of false realism is what makes the scares that much more effective. Immersion can come in many forms, but the primary factors are the atmosphere, the graphics, and the narrative." End quote. While Screenrant's definition from the article is okay, but as stated with all the previously mentioned pieces, that better expands upon what articles such as this one in a very broad manner are saying to achieve immersion. Let's dive into those pieces to see where those pieces fit together to form the whole, starting with what makes a player truly fearful is The unknown. Quote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Unquote. By H.P. Lovecraft. That quote from H.P. Lovecraft is accurate on a lot of levels, as it's an instinctive reaction to help keep us safe. That instinct has developed and grown over time as humanity's technology has grown and discovered new unknowns. When people are faced with the unknown of something, no matter what the topic or context, they become fearful because they do not know what may happen next or the consequences of not handling something in the manner it should have. This fear is the foundation of effective horror, where the game introduces an unknown, whether it be a situation, possible threat, or consequence of previous actions, to add on to the fear. One of the most famous examples is the Alien franchise. While the alien unknown has been explained through its movies with some backstory on why they exist and also how they can be killed, the impact of the unknown fades away rather fast, and a lot of fear surrounding its media fades with it. Things like this show it's better if and when possible to not explain the why, where, and how of an unknown until its final climax, where there is no need for any continued stories involving it. Obviously, when it comes to the Aliens franchise, that is not really possible because of the position that it's in with popular ongoing media, including the horror game Sphere. The Alien Isolation game unfortunately falls prey to its other media sources, and even if the player has only watched one of the movies, then they already have an idea what to expect throughout the game, and that fear will quickly fall away. If the player has never watched an Alien movie, then it will be better, but because of how the story is, will confuse them, eventually leading to a similar fear fading away problem. Several other games fall into the same problem of giving too much information about the unknown and or the manners of taking down enemies, such as Dead Space and Resident Evil. By the end of these games, the general background of the enemies are discovered by the player, but even more so is that they have defeated tens if not hundreds of enemies, so part of the unknown fear has disappeared. When the unknown fear disappears or never really existed to begin with, the game itself remains only horror in the theming. But one of the most well-known pieces of effective horror, no matter if the game is more horror-themed or not, adds to the fear is... Effective horror always has isolation in its roots. When the player is in a group of others, whether it be NPCs or more players, whatever horror there is lessened significantly because of having help in a physical and mental sense. When the player is alone and has no one to turn to for help in any direct way,
Does not seem that bad.
the fear of isolation escalates. But no horror game that uses just isolation or has it be the primary horror piece will fail because isolation is only a part of the foundation and it heavily relies on all the other pieces to be effective. So often, if any horror game has others with the player, they are quickly separated or removed from the equation, so it does not allow the player to become more comfortable, while at the same time making the fear of isolation more prevalent. Ripping away that form of comfort instead of having the player start off alone can be very effective if done right, where the player can feel helpless. If the game forces it, where it feels more absurd than anything, where the player has some level of confidence that they could have stopped it, then that attempt at fear will fail. There are multiple horror games or situations in games that have more than just a singular player involved, such as Devour, Pacify, Phasmophobia, or the Outlast trials, etc. These games may scare all the players once or twice when first experiencing it, yet they will all still fall into the category of being horror themed and not having any form of fear stay in the forefront of the players' minds. These co-op horror games fail to keep some type of fear in the players' minds for different reasons, but the biggest that cannot be overcome is a lack of isolation. If certain aspects are handled correctly, even with multiple people in a horror game can bring back some of that fear, which is dread, the anticipation of fear where the player may or may not know what is around the next corner. Dread is one of the more difficult things to instill onto a player, as anticipation after the beginning of the game naturally fades. Dread and tension are tied to each other. If one part fails, then the other will too. Tension will be built up along with dread, and some of the best ways to do that is to have the player hear or be shown indications of an enemy or situation that they will not immediately know how to handle. While dread and tension is built up by the the rest of the pieces, they should be able to take a step forward and not always rely on those pieces. The problem with this new enemy or situation is if that new thing is too difficult or causes frustration in some way, then that dread and tension will fall apart completely and are unlikely to recover anytime soon. Something that is frequently done in horror, which may work once, but on any follow-ups, the player's eyes may just roll instead, are jump scares. Jump scares throw dread and tension to the side, in a sense jumping in front of them and ignoring the entire piece. Jump scares heavily damage a horror game's effectiveness and leave a bad taste in every player's mouth. More often than not, they just get a feeling of being cheated for better ways to scare them. An example of where this fails is Metroid Dread. While the game has elements of horror but does not focus on it, the game still tries to push dread and tension with the Emmy enemies, but because of how the design and difficulty of the game is in general, when the game tries to push the main bigger enemies, being the Emmys, the problem is that they can typically become frustrating and the dread that they want to instill may turn into an annoyance, if not worse, due to the design of the Emmys. While in comparison, a general good execution of dread and tension is the Resident Evil 2 remake with Mr. X.
No. Wait. Wait.
The dread and tension of Mr. X is at a fast pace because of how often and frequently he can appear, but unlike Metroid Dread, Mr. X typically causes far less frustration because the player is just supposed to run away from him and not interact with him, while the player is forced to defeat the enemies to progress, and the interactions with them are much less fun. Hearing Mr. X stomping throughout the halls in the player's direction, making tensions rise, and that creeping dread of when he's going to show up again, and what the player is going to have to do to avoid him once again. Mr. X is designed around one of the biggest horror pieces of a game, either being a true horror game or just horror themed, which is unlike games that build the player up into a one-man army and gives them a power fantasy, a key part of effective horror is disempowerment, where the player does not have or is stripped of anything that makes them more of a threat to the enemies that they may encounter. That does not mean the player cannot have any tools or weapons at their disposal, but those tools or weapons cannot quickly or easily dispose of enemies, or the player can get away from them if they fail to follow what the game is wanting them to do. A game that does not do the best for disempowerment, at least at the beginning, like it could have done, but still a good horror themed game, is Dead Space, whether it be the original games or the remake. The player is only disarmed at the beginning of the game, where they are forced to run to safety, but immediately upon picking up that iconic weapon, disempowerment falls away because the player can now take down the enemies that they were fearful of rather quickly and easily. They could have made it so the plasma cutter was either less powerful and or change the level design in less of a linear manner, where the player could sneak around the enemies and either completely avoid them or take them down in a surprise way. The Resident Evil 2 remake once again does a good job at disempowerment even with a gun, where even at the start the player has limited ammo and the enemies are not easily killed. Even later weapons, while more powerful, the player remains disempowered for the same reasons. But the game does falter on other pieces of the horror puzzle. While being disempowered is a good piece of the puzzle, the game should always have ways to incentivize the player to learn more about the threats and the world that they are faced with. For a game's story to be effective, no matter the primary focus of it, should have intrigue. The game should be leaving story breadcrumbs along the way to intrigue the player.
Who left this mess? This is how you get ants.
Making them pursue the story and all of its connections. A horror story should include the breadcrumbs of the world and enemies, but not giving too much away about what, where, and how things came to be. Because as mentioned earlier, giving too much away will make the fear of the unknown and intrigue around that piece of the story fade, in turn causing the player to be less threatened subconsciously and look at the enemy before them as more of a normal thing in that world than a special unknown threat to be feared. A game that has good intrigue with its story is Soma. The game does falter in its gameplay and pacing at points, but its story is what keeps the game held together. The game starts off in an unexpected manner and kind of confuses the player on what's going on, but as the player continues forward in this new unknown location, the breadcrumbs begin to fall in front of them with the story as a whole and the enemies that they have to avoid. The player remains interested in the story, then those breadcrumbs will suffice, but if they want more to the game game than primarily the story, it cannot keep them going. A game with much stronger parts holding it together is Alan Wake 2. The gameplay will keep most players interested, along with the breadcrumbs of an intriguing story that continuously evolves and slightly reforms as the story progresses. Alan Wake 2 does a good job at taking all of the pieces that have been previously discussed and doing a good job balancing them, including the rest of the pieces that are yet to be discussed, but in particular the next piece being the ability of a game's story to not be predictable, yet at the same time not be absurd with any twists and turns, is difficult. Unpredictability is something a lot of game stories in general struggle to achieve. Unpredictability is a double-edged sword, where if the twists and turns make it confusing or absurd, then the chances of a player losing interest in a story increases significantly. Warning, going to spoil the ending of Prey 2017. If you do not want the ending spoiled, then please skip to this timestamp. A jarring twist that puts a bad taste in some players' mouths was Prey 2017 with its ending. There were subtle hints throughout the game that could lead the player to the final ending twist, but the problem is that the unpredicted ending had nothing directly mentioning the possible outcome of such a negative ending. Players do not want to have an unpredictable twist that is negative, and they can feel tricked. Even in this case, all the work they put in was for nothing but a simulation. Alan Wake 2 in comparison has good unpredictable twists that do not the same problems as other games like Prey 2017. The twists come along with the player discovering and figuring out the possible puzzle because of whom they primarily control throughout the game. While every game does not need to have a similar way of going about unpredicted twists and turns, they should have hints scattered throughout which are subtle and more straightforward. Unpredictability is a very necessary piece to keep the game interesting, but is heavily intertwined with one of the most important effective horror pieces being one of the biggest and most important pieces of an effective horror game is the narrative, no contest. Any game can be horror themed, but without a convincing story will leave a player disconnected from the game. The players still may be enjoying the gameplay, but will not really care about what is happening throughout the game, leaving a lackluster impression by the end. The narrative really needs to have a good convincing beginning reason why the player is in that situation and why they do not have the option to immediately escape from it. A solid narrative beginning is needed for the first impressions, but also is needed for the character the player controls. If they are a silent character where the player embodies them, the narrative should explain why they never speak or have internal thoughts about the situation in some way, along with an unshakable reason for them being in that situation with enough backstory to ground them in that world. An example is being in a line of work that they are required to investigate the situation. If the character the player controls does speak, then the narrative needs to make them likable and or relatable, because if the protagonist is unlikable, then the player will have more of a difficult time wanting to play the game and following it. The narrative should have a clear end goal, but even if any sub-goals to achieve that end goal may change with some unpredictability, but the end goal may have an unexpected twist, but not a pure negative one that feels like the player wasted their time. Along with that, should explain what is generally happening in the situation around the player, but with intriguing breadcrumbs, not giving away too much, but enough to lead the player forward in the story and gameplay. A more recently remade example with narrative problems is the Silent Hill 2 remake. The game's story is hard to follow, and even if the player is reading notes and other things to help piece things together, it only helps a small amount. While the overall story is to find James' wife, the situation that he is in, along with who he encounters and why they matter to the story, only adds to the confusion. James' actions of continuing forward blindly through the situation is not helped either, as he does not think nor question how to go about finding his wife in a different manner at all.
But I think you should stay away. This town, there's something wrong with it. And it's not just the fog either.
Is it dangerous?
Maybe.
Alan Wake 2 again is an example of generally good writing where the story has a strong beginning to hook the player, moving to clear sub-goals and an end goal. Likeable characters, including the player protagonist, the backstories of the characters are overall believable and understandable and why they stay around this situation. The unpredictability is enough where the player cannot easily predict what may happen next, but remains believable and not absurd with a reasonable ending, but a bit disappointing. But none of that matters if the game fails to have a good convincing next piece, which is the atmosphere of a game's world plays the most subtle part. No matter the game genre, without a convincing atmosphere, no player will really believe the world, let alone the situation they are in, to be believable. A horror game's atmosphere needs to have a darker tone of sorts to it. Things are not in a normal state, unnerving music, messy or disorganized, chaotic, possibly damaged, possibly gross from something dead or things growing abnormally in the environment, physically darker due to the lack of light because of the spot the player is in, etc.
Oh, this place is not too bad.
I immediately regret this decision.
When these things are done right, it helps keep the player's mind stay convinced of the player's world and situation, subconsciously adding to the fear. If one or more of the parts of the atmosphere is off in some way, such as a normal bright day outside when it's supposed to be a horror experience, the player will be at ease and no matter what is shown or said will have far less of an impact. The Fear to Fathom games, while based on likely true stories, have the problem of a consistent horror atmosphere. When the scares start to pick up, the atmosphere may not have been shaped to have the player's fears start to roll in. In turn, the player is not likely going to take the situation as seriously and become truly unnerved like the story is trying to portray. While on the better execution side of games is Amnesia the Bunker. From the first few moments of the game to when the player actually takes over to start playing, the atmosphere is set well. Because of the game being set in World War I, the situation itself is already unnerving and a bit scary, but when the player arrives at a desolate and ruined bunker, with it being so dark and claustrophobic, only elevates that atmosphere even more. Throughout the game, it never feels like the player is truly safe, no matter if the player is in a safe room or not. That feeling of the monster or things possibly going wrong lurks in the back of their mind. This atmosphere is hard to keep constant without it feeling overbearing and the player just becoming annoyed with it because it may cause frustrations with the gameplay. The atmosphere and narrative fall apart when the final piece is not handled correctly, which is the final piece of the effective horror game puzzle is the logic of the situation, which is crucial for maintaining a coherent narrative where the context is in a neutral and clear manner, resulting in the player being convinced of the situation being realistic for that world. If something is absurd, such as narrative goals, character actions/reactions, then the player will be taken out of the game's story and world entirely. If a player's reaction is to roll their eyes because of something being so absurd in the game, then it is already lost, and the game is likely not to bring them back into it. Unfortunately, all the Resident Evil games suffer from this point of narrative writing.
I'm guessing you don't have a key in one of those fancy pockets?
Unfortunately, no. But how are you doing?
Hell no, man. What
No.
the fuck, man?
From the very beginning of each game, the narrative is rather absurd, only made worse by the characters' actions and reactions to what they encounter. The player is immediately taken out of the story from the start, and because all the game stories stick to their guns, for better or for worse, never allowing the player to be truly pulled back in. While, once again, with Amnesia the Bunker, even though the story is simple, it is clearly understood and the player character has appropriate actions and reactions to the situation. Now that all the pieces have been briefly explained, effective horror games can now be better seen for what makes them truly special. But out of all the games mentioned within the pieces discussed, most of them falter in one area or another. So what games truly tick all the effective horror boxes? Out of all of the horror games that I am aware of and have played, only one comes the closest. While it has never truly released and you cannot even play it anymore, and that is the Silent Hill PT demo on PS4. Even for just a demo, it does an excellent excellent job for immersing the player in the situation that they find themselves in. While it lacks any story and goals for the player to pursue because it's a demo, so that can be waved off, due to how simple it is, just walking through a hallway and trying to figure out how to break the cycle and get out is good enough. While no horror games have ever achieved the effect of horror perfection, and one has gone the closest, it does not mean the rest of the horror games in the genre are bad and should be waved off, because more often than not, they bring something interesting to the table even if it's not executed in the best way. Every game has its highlights and it's up to you, the player, to find them. Thank you for watching my second video, hope you enjoyed it along with it being an overall improvement compared to the first video, and I hope to see you next time.